I just ran the 3060 Ti and the RX 9060 XT 16GB through a ton of benchmarks at a variety of graphic settings in the latest games of 2025, including 1080p, 1440p, native resolutions, as well as upscaled using quality level upscaling on 1080p, balance level upscaling on 1440p, and I didn't just look at maximum graphic settings, I also looked at medium graphic settings, again at native and upscaled resolutions. In this video, we have the 3060 Ti represented by NVIDIA's Founders Edition and the 9060 XT represented by the Asus Prime. Again, this is the 16GB model, not the 8GB model. And the goal in this video is to look at, well, how much better is a 9060 XT 16GB? It's definitely better. So one reason you might be watching this video is you have a 3060 Ti, maybe you're wanting a bit more performance, maybe you want something with more VRAM. Is the 9060 XT 16GB worth the upgrade? And while you can look at charts like this, which is, okay, the average FPS, and you've got blue for the 9060 XT, you've got the red in the 3060 Ti, and this is just a lot to look through, right? So while we can break this down with a whole bunch of charts, I think I actually like us to go back around and look at side-by-side footage for a second to really process what's happening in each of these comparisons. So I can get my head out of the way here, and then we can hit play. And what we're going to be looking at here, probably don't need the sound in the background, is on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got the 3060 Ti. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have the 9060 XT. And we can look at how they play in the latest game. So here we can see that in Monster Hunter Wilds, the biggest release of 2025, by sales at least, there's missing textures on the left-hand side of the screen because the 8GB of VRAM just doesn't hold all of those textures in its memory. Also, that's affecting performance. We can see a really spiky frame time graph on the left-hand side. And we can see, just overall performance numbers pretty low with the 3060 Ti only averaging 35 FPS at these settings. Now, it's totally true that you can turn down the graphic settings to fit better in that 8GB VRAM buffer, and we'll absolutely test that. But it's important to note that the 9060 XT, with its additional performance as well as additional VRAM, doesn't need to turn down graphic settings to play this game. It's averaging 56 FPS, which on a variable refresh rate display is perfectly playable at these settings. Not that you might not also want to turn it down for additional performance, but again, you don't necessarily have to if you're on the 9060 XT, again, averaging 60% faster here in the averages and 76% faster in the 1% lows, and again, not missing the textures. Now, if you want a bit more performance, we could try using upscaling, which can also slightly reduce the VRAM load, but not by enough to fit it within the 8GB of VRAM here. Here we are seeing the 3060 Ti get to a 39 FPS average now, which still isn't great, but also its 1% lows are actually even worse now. And only down in the teens, and look at that spiky frame time graph, you're still missing the textures, but now the 9060 XT is cruising right along at a 66 FPS average, putting it a nice 69% faster than the 3060 Ti in the averages, but really it's a bigger difference than that, because if you look at the 1% lows, talking about like the stuttery performance, the 9060 XT is over 3 times better with 1% lows at 49 versus 15. And we have FSR4 looking quite nice here, because again, that's another area where AMD has made a lot of improvements with this generation. But again, we do need to be fair. If you're on a 3060 Ti, you can just turn down graphic settings. If we turn ray tracing off and go down to the medium preset, now the 3060 Ti is within its 8GB VRAM buffer for the most part. It's hitting 47 FPS average, which is a lot more playable, if still not great. And its 1% lows are now 39, and the frame time graph looks a lot better, and I'm not spotting any missing textures. So the 3060 Ti is now at least playable, although the 9060 XT is still 51% faster and averaging a nice, smooth 71 FPS now. But you could also use upscaling on top of the medium settings. This gets the 3060 Ti to now where I would consider probably where people would really be maybe trying to play. 56 FPS average, it's close to a 60 FPS average on a variable refresh rate display. It's not a big deal, not missing any textures. The newer upscaling models look pretty reasonable at even at 1080p quality. And you're doing fine. That being said, the 9060 XT is 50% faster at 84 FPS, so much smoother experience. But again, you could still play Monster Hunter Wilds on your 3060 Ti. It just means going down to medium settings and using upscaling, whereas the 9060 XT had about that same performance at maximum settings native resolution. But you might also be trying to use these GPUs on a 1440p display, so let's take a look at that. First, at maximum settings native resolution, again, VRAM's an issue. You see a bunch of missing textures on the left-hand side of the screen. The average FPS is only 30 and 1% lows at 18 with spiky frame time graphs. It's a bad experience on the 3060 Ti if you try to just max this game out at 1440p. However, the 9060 XT isn't doing amazingly well here due to the 1440p max settings is hard to render here, but it's still 43 FPS, which is also a 43% improvement over the 3060 Ti, and it's almost double the 1% lows, so it's a much smoother experience. Now, let's go ahead and kick on some upscaling. Using FSR and DLSS at their balance settings, we see the 3060 Ti is still missing stuff, missing textures. It just looks wrong. Performance averages are up to 42 FPS for the 3060 Ti, but again, the graphics are just broken. Whereas the 9060 XT is now hitting 56 FPS average. It's 33% faster than the 3060 Ti, but it's actually rendering correctly. And I would say it's now extremely playable here. Another option, though, would be to turn down to medium graphics settings. This helps the 3060 Ti stay within its 8GB VRAM buffer, but at native 1440p, it's still pretty demanding. The 3060 Ti only offering 37 FPS. The 9060 XT offering 54, which is pretty playable even at native resolution here, and it's 46% faster than the 3060 Ti. Turning on FSR and DLSS to the balance settings, we're seeing a 70 FPS average now for the 9060 XT, but the 3060 Ti is now putting up 50 FPS, so in a single-player game, especially one that you might be controlling on a controller here, on a variable refresh rate display, this is perfectly playable, but I think you would definitely be noticing the 9060 XT if you switched over to that, right? Getting that 70 FPS versus 50, it's 40% faster, much smoother experience, and again, FSR 4 looking great here. Now, what if we switch to one of the other biggest releases of the year with Oblivion Remastered and Unreal Engine 5? This game at max settings 1080p does go over 8GB of VRAM again. You can see a spiky frame time graph, bad 1% lows, but neither GPU is doing amazing at 45 FPS versus 29, but it is a 55% lead for the 9060 XT. Kicking on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, and once again, FSR 4 is looking very, very competitive here. I would say it is absolutely usable to upscale at 1080p now using FSR, whereas before I would avoid it at all costs. The 9060 XT is at 58 FPS, so perfectly playable now, making it 32% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is only at 44, and the 1% lows are showing an even larger difference at 61% advantage for the 9060 XT, 45 versus 28. Now, that being said, you could go down to medium settings, turn off the hardware ray tracing, go to software-based Lumen at low settings, and we are now at 65 FPS on the 3060 Ti, but 91 FPS on the 9060 XT, putting it 40% faster and an even better 65% faster in the 1% lows. If we now also turn on DLSS and FSR to their quality settings, which again I do think is usable now at 1080p on the newer models for DLSS and FSR, we're seeing very high frame rates at 114 versus 86. So both doing well, but the 9060 XT is 33% faster. It actually, in the 1% lows, 79% faster at 93 versus 52. And interestingly, even at these settings, the 9060 XT is showing allocation of 9GB of VRAM. So it's possible that is helping out the smoothness of the 1% lows. You can see less micro stutter in the frame time graphs. 1440p max settings, the 3060 Ti falls apart to 19 FPS average and only 12 in the 1% lows, but the 9060 XT is probably not going to really use these settings either at only 32 FPS. So despite being 68% faster, it's probably not the settings you would actually be using. But what if we use DLSS and FSR at their balance settings? Now, the 9060 XT is only 24% faster in the averages at 47 versus 38, although 61% faster in the 1% lows at 37 versus 23. So there's some signs here that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is still an issue on the 3060 Ti, despite using the aggressive upscale, and that's causing some stuttering problems for the 3060 Ti. The 9060 XT, I mean, some people find 40 or 50 FPS playable in slow-paced single-player games like this, so these are settings somebody might use, although personally I would probably be chasing more like a 60 FPS average. Now, if we go down to medium settings and turn the hardware RT off and switch over to software lumen low, the 9060 XT is now giving us about 60 FPS average at 59, which is 26% faster than the 3060 Ti at 47, although a larger difference in the 1% lows at 61% advantage. Now, if we also use upscaling on the medium preset on a 1440p display, at balanced settings, DLSS and FSR, the 9060 XT is now offering 90 FPS average, which is 25% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is putting up a very, very usable and respectable 72 FPS. So again, you can still absolutely play this game on a 3060 Ti on a 1440p display at the right settings. It's just that the 9060 XT could have used higher settings, or it could give you higher FPS at these reduced settings. Now, switching over to Spiderman 2, 1080p max settings, which does include a lot of ray tracing, we're well over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, crushing the 3060 Ti's performance, and the 9060 XT is 84% faster and very usable at 57 FPS. If we use DLSS and FSR quality upscaling, the 9060 XT hits 78 FPS average, which is completely usable. Even its 1% lows are at 60 FPS. It's a very good experience here on the 9060 XT, whereas the 3060 Ti is still stuttery and beyond its VRAM buffer, hitting 42 FPS average and only 23 in the 1% lows. So this is definitely showing that the 16 gigabytes of VRAM is paying off here, as well as the additional performance to give a nice, smooth experience on the 9060 XT at these settings. Whereas at 1080p medium settings, the 3060 Ti is now giving you a reasonable experience. In fact, nice high average FPS at 84, although the 1% lows are only 46, so potentially still some issues with the VRAM buffer. Hard to say exactly, but the 9060 XT is 42% faster in the averages at 119 and 54% faster in the 1% lows at 71. Again, I think some of that stuttering 1% lows are being helped by the additional VRAM. We're seeing allocation and per process usage beyond 8 gigabytes on the 9060 XT. At 1080p medium settings using DLSS and FSR quality, we can see both GPUs putting up triple-digit averages at 112 and 152. 9060 XT is 36% faster. And in the 1% lows, we're seeing both of them over 60, with the 3060 Ti at 66 and the 9060 XT at 97. So, the 3060 Ti can absolutely play this game at the right settings at high frame rates and even get the 1% lows under control. But again, the 9060 XT offers higher frame rates at those settings, or it could have used higher settings. At 1440p max settings, even the 9060 XT is struggling a bit here at 39 FPS versus 22 on the 3060 Ti. 1% lows are only 26 and 11, so despite the 9060 XT having a huge lead in both the averages and the 1% lows here, I don't think these would be the optimal settings to use even on the 9060 XT. Although if you were trying to max out the game, it's certainly doing a better job of doing it, but I think it would make sense to at least use some upscaling here. If we do that and use balanced level FSR and DLSS, and again, FSR 4 looking very, very competitive here, very usable at these settings, the 9060 XT is now able to hit 54 FPS average, which puts it a nice 69% faster than the 32 FPS average on the 3060 Ti, because we are definitely beyond an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer here. In fact, it's barely fitting within a 16 gigabyte buffer if you look at the memory figures on the 9060 XT. 1% lows are especially telling here at 36 versus 17. So you might play the game here, although it is under a 60 FPS average. Switching to medium settings, though, at 1440p native resolution, even the 3060 Ti is almost good for 60 FPS, although getting the 1% lows a bit low at 30. 58 as the average. The 9060 XT is 41% faster than the averages at 82 FPS and 47% faster in the 1% lows at 44 FPS. So these are, I would say, usable settings on both GPUs, although again, it might make sense to use a bit of upscaling here to increase frame rates and get even the VRAM a little bit lower as well, especially on the 3060 Ti. By using DLSS and FSR balanced on the medium preset, the 3060 Ti is now averaging 91 FPS, and the 9060 XT hits 119, 31% faster. In the 1% lows, we see 51 FPS versus 71. So the 9060 XT is 39% faster in the 1% lows and 31% faster in the averages. Again, some sign that having additional VRAM beyond 8 gigabytes is improving the spikes in the frame time graph a little bit and improving the 1% lows. Switching over to another top seller for the year, Assassin's Creed Shadows at 1080p max settings, which does include ray tracing. The 9060 XT is 56% faster in the averages, although it only hits 39 FPS itself. 3060 Ti is down at 25, so it's the difference between, like I said, some people playing on a controller might be okay with kind of a 40-ish FPS experience, even though it's not the settings I would choose. So, somebody might find these settings usable on the 9060 XT, although it's not particularly great. I think I would at least kick on some upscaling, which if we take a look here, gets the 9060 XT up to 47 FPS, putting it 57% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is at 30. And again, there's signs of going over the 8GB VRAM buffer here again. 1% lows are 40 versus 24, so 67% faster there for the 9060 XT. Although, again, I think we're kind of on the borderline of settings I would consider usable on the 9060 XT. Now, if we go all the way down to medium preset and switch ray tracing to hideout only, which I think basically turns it off for this location that's being tested here, we're now hitting 57 FPS on the 3060 Ti. So almost a 60 FPS average there, although the 9060 XT is good for 83 FPS. 46% faster than the 3060 Ti, and 49% faster in the 1% lows at 73 versus 49. If we also kick on upscaling on the medium preset, DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, and again, FSR 4 is available here and looking quite sharp, we're seeing 92 FPS versus 67, so both GPUs doing well here, although the 9060 XT is certainly offering a much more high refresh rate experience. If we switch over to 1440p, neither GPU does a good job maxing it out. 31 FPS on the 9060 XT versus only 22 on the 3060 Ti, and we're definitely beyond the 8GB VRAM buffer, but again, are you really going to use these settings on the 9060 XT? I mean, consoles sometimes shoot for a 30 FPS average, so maybe there's somebody out there who would choose this, but probably not what I would do. I would at least kick on DLSS and FSR to balanced, which gets the 9060 XT up to 42 FPS average. So it's more, I found on my Steam Deck, the hitting 40 FPS versus hitting 30 FPS is actually worlds apart. So this I could more see somebody using, although probably I would still be shooting for a higher frame rate average. Whereas the 3060 Ti is averaging under 30 FPS and the 1% lows are only down at 23. Now, if we switch to medium settings, now the 9060 XT is over 60 FPS, even at native 1440p at 67 FPS average, putting it 46% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is only averaging 46. Again, could play at those settings, but a much nicer experience on the 9060 XT. If we also use upscaling, though, which I think would be recommended here, on both GPUs, we're now getting the 9060 XT up to a nice, smooth 81 FPS, putting it 29% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is now averaging over 60 FPS, though, at 63. Now, if we switch over to Doom the Dark Ages, this game, when I say max settings here, it was the Ultra Nightmare settings before the path tracing update. These videos take a long time for me to produce, so the path tracing update came out after I performed the benchmarking in Doom the Dark Ages. So anyway, this is max settings other than path tracing. We're seeing 74 FPS versus 57. And if we kick on DLSS and FSR at their quality setting, it's now 100 FPS versus 75. Although I'll mention this game only supports FSR 3, which I think if you look at the side-by-sides, although dark scenes don't get a lot of YouTube compression, it is noticeably sharper on the left-hand side of the screen, in my opinion here. Anyway, if we switch over to medium setting, it's 86 versus 64 at native res. I'd probably use those settings, and if we use upscaling, we're now at 122 versus 86. If we switch over to 1440p max non-path tracing settings, we're at 52 versus 39, which is a 33% faster result for the 9060 XT, although it's still not a 60 FPS average. And if we kick on upscaling, let me jump back there for a second. So if we kick on upscaling on the Ultra Nightmare settings, we're at 82 FPS versus 60. However, I'd be much more willing to use this upscaling on the 3060 Ti, whereas on the 9060 XT, I'd be a little more hesitant just with FSR3 not looking amazing here. Although this game does support XeSS upscaling, which you might try out on the 9060 XT. Again, I don't think FSR4 has a Vulkan implementation yet at this point, which is, I think, why this game does not have an FSR4 support. Now, at 1440p medium settings, the 9060 XT can be around 60 FPS at native resolution, hitting 59 FPS in this scene, whereas the 3060 Ti is at 43. Now, using DLSS and FSR balance gets up to 97 and 69 respectively, which is a lot nicer, but the, again, FSR upscaling does not necessarily look that great here. So again, that's just one of the issues we run into sometimes with FSR4 support. Now, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 gives the 3060 Ti a Pyrrhic victory at 1080p max settings. The experimental settings just do not run well, really on either GPU, but they especially seem to not run well on my AMD hardware, with the 9060 XT actually taking a loss to the 3060 Ti for the first time in this video. But again, I don't think you're going to use these settings on either GPU. Using DLSS and FSR quality gets the 3060 Ti up to 39 FPS, which again, I mean, around 40 FPS, some people might find that a usable experience in a slow-paced RPG like this. However, given how much higher frame rates you can get using different settings, I still don't think this would be an optimal choice. For example, if you use native resolution at medium settings, both GPUs are in the triple digits, with the 3060 Ti hitting 104 and the 9060 XT only 14% faster at 119. So you can see, even at the non-experimental settings, this is not a particularly good game for AMD GPUs, where generally the 9060 XT has had much higher leads than this. So we're back to having a lead, but only by 14%, which certainly feels out of the typical result that we've seen so far in this video. Kicking on DLSS and FSR quality, we do have FSR4 support again. We're now seeing a 13% lead at 141 versus 125. If we go to 1440p and go back to max settings, the 3060 Ti is taking a lead again, but again, we're at less than 30 FPS, so I don't think anybody would be using these settings. And using DLSS and FSR balanced, we're still under 30 FPS on both GPUs. It's basically a tie at 28 versus 27. The 3060 Ti didn't really gain much performance, I think, with DLSS here, because it was still, I think, over 8 gigabytes of VRAM allocation, causing it some problems. At 1440p medium settings, though, which would be much more appropriate, we're now seeing 72 FPS and 81 FPS, respectively, 13% faster for the 9060 XT. So again, not an amazing win here, but it is a win. And DLSS and FSR balance, we do have, again, FSR4 support, and it's looking good here. 11% faster on the 9060 XT at 109 versus 98. If we switch over to Clair Obscur Expedition 33, at 1080p max settings, we're actually seeing some issues with 8 gigabytes of VRAM right here as you load into this scene. We're seeing some stuttering and spikes on the frame time graph for the 3060 Ti. That means that while the 9060 XT is only 27% faster on average, it's 48% faster in the 1% lows. Now, it's fair to point out that after we're a little further into this, the frame time graph smooths out for the 3060 Ti. So this is a game where it's close to the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, and in a lot of scenes you'll be fine, but there are scenes, especially when you load into a new area, where it gets kind of spiky. That being said, we're only at 52 FPS even on the 9060 XT, so you might want to turn down the settings anyway. Now, if we use upscaling, this is a game that does not have any form of FSR4 support or even FSR3 support. It does have XeSS support, which if I set to the same internal rendering resolution as DLSS quality, XeSS would have a different name for that. I think they would call it ultra quality. But it's the same internal rendering resolution at 67%. We can see that the 9060 XT takes an 18% lead in performance at 72 versus 61, although I do think I prefer the DLSS image compared to the XeSS image. Now at 1080p medium settings, we're hitting 84 FPS versus 63, which is a 33% lead for the 9060 XT, and both GPUs are actually very usable here. And if we once again use upscaling, again, same issue with only having XeSS support, we're at 104 FPS versus 86, 21% lead for the 9060 XT in performance, but again, maybe a bit of an image quality edge for DLSS. You can use something like Optiscaler to mod in FSR4 support here, although I haven't tried it myself, and I've heard some people report some stability issues when they're doing that. 1440p max settings, look at the 1% lows and stuttery frame time graph. It's beyond an 8GB VRAM buffer, but performance numbers are low enough even on the 9060 XT that I don't think these are the settings you're going to use at only 35 FPS and 27 FPS. If we use upscaling, though, the 3060 Ti hits 54 FPS and the 9060 XT only hits 60 using XeSS at the resolution equivalent to DLSS balanced at 58% internal rendering resolution. So again, would love to have FSR4 support built into the game, but we don't. At 1440p medium settings, though, we're at 58 FPS versus 46, 26% lead for the 9060 XT, and near a 60 FPS average without any upscaling. Using the upscaling, though, gets us to 88 FPS versus 75, only a 17% lead for the 9060 XT, but is still a lead, although in performance. Now, image quality, I do think, again, if you look at like the particles and things like that, I think you get a little more ghosting trails on the XeSS image, things like that. So I do think it's a bit of an image quality edge for the 3060 Ti here. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at 1080p max settings. The 9060 XT only takes a 9% lead. So I've seen a lot of times in Unreal Engine 4 games, which this is, that AMD kind of seems to underperform compared to their typical results. And that's what we're seeing here. And again, 75 FPS versus 69, both are playable here. Having a nice experience even on the 3060 Ti at 1080p max settings. Now, if you did try to upscale, though, this is where things get pretty bad for AMD because there is no XeSS, there is no FSR, there is DLSS, though. So you're stuck with Unreal Engine 4's TAAU upscaler, which looks quite bad. Now, Optiscaler works well in this game to put FSR4 support into the game, but again, now you're having to do an external mod, which is a bit inconvenient. But I do have a video talking about Optiscaler if you're interested, and I do demonstrate it working well in this game to get FSR4 support modded in. Anyway, 1080p medium settings, we're looking at 87 FPS versus 78, 12% lead for the 9060 XT. And at 1440p max settings, we're at 59 versus 54. I didn't do 1080p medium upscaled because this game has a 120 FPS frame rate cap, and that would start to affect the results. At 1440p max with upscaling, again, TAAU is looking pretty awful. DLSS is looking pretty solid. So while the 9060 XT is 12% faster, it doesn't look very good relatively. So there is that. All right, at 1440p medium settings, we're at 69, which is pretty nice compared to 48, 44% lead for the 9060 XT. And it was right at this point. Let me actually go back for a second here. Let's see, where were we? So in the 1440p medium results, I want to take a closer look at this because at first the 3060 Ti is not that far behind the 9060 XT, and it seems to be doing fine. But notice partway through the run, it seems to fill up its VRAM buffer and performance suddenly tanks. It's going to be as we round this corner. Notice the frame time graph starts spiking heavily with much larger frame time spikes, and overall frame times just got worse partway through that run on the 3060 Ti. So this is again an example of a game that's right on that 8GB borderline, even at medium settings 1440p. And then just sometimes you just fill up that VRAM buffer and it just starts stuttering awfully. And that's what we saw happen here. And that's why we're seeing the larger lead for the 9060 XT now. Anyway, using DLSS seems to get that under control since we were right on that borderline, slightly decreasing the internal rendering resolutions helping out. So now the 3060 Ti is averaging 77 FPS. But again, TAAU on the 9060 XT not looking great, so 18% performance lead, but not really looking that great doing it. Again, Optiscaler would do a good job of solving that problem. All right, let's go ahead and pop out for some final thoughts on this comparison. Okay. So it is annoying that some games don't have FSR4 support. DLSS support is better overall, but I have demonstrated in other videos that Optiscaler can go a long way to adding FSR4 support into games that don't have it, but it's annoying to have to do that, and games that have anti-cheat software, you wouldn't want to use it, so online games, things like that. So that's a bit annoying. Also, older like Unreal Engine 4 games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth seem to not perform super well on the 9060 XT, being a bit below its typical results. That being said, if you look at the overall results, the 9060 XT does tend to be noticeably faster than the 3060 Ti. And again, if you look at something like, let's say, 50 FPS line here, you can see that there's many games where the blue line can be well over that, and I would deem it then quite playable, whereas the red line is certainly well under that, and that can be a bit frustrating for 3060 Ti users. How can we summarize this data in other ways, though? Another option is to look at the percentage advantage. So this is basically saying, on average, what percentage performance increase do you get if you upgrade from a 3060 Ti to a 9060 XT 16 gigabyte? I'm seeing that the geomean of these results is that you would be seeing on average a 31% performance increase. Now, it's important to note that there are games where you'll see less, like I said, Unreal Engine 4 games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Another older engine with Come Deliverance 2 is another one where we're seeing only in the teens, and even at certain settings a loss, but not particularly usable settings anyway, where we're seeing a loss for the 9060 XT. However, again, most of the results are somewhere between a mid 20% increase and even a 60 or 70 or 80% increase. Now, those larger performance increases are usually in situations where we were beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And it was important to note when we looked at side-by-side results that often in games where we're beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM, some people like to argue, but they're not at settings that are usable anyway. And I would say that no, oftentimes the 9060 XT is strong enough to use those settings. 1080p max settings here, even with ray tracing cranked up, 9060 XT is just shy of a 60 FPS average. And using some upscaling like FSR quality gets it over a 60 FPS average, even at otherwise maxed out settings. And FSR quality at 1080p is now looking pretty good if you have FSR4 support in the game. So there's that. Now, that being said, though, I think we could break this down a little bit more. I think some people wonder about, oh, if I go to AMD, how's my ray tracing? Well, interestingly here, the ray tracing performance differential is actually an even bigger lead for the 9060 XT. I'm showing 49% faster. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that AMD did greatly increase their ray tracing performance with the 9000 series. So that helps, but also, ray tracing requires additional VRAM compared to trying to do the same thing without ray tracing on average, which means that oftentimes the situations where we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM are situations where we're trying to use ray tracing, which is why I'm actually seeing a 49% improvement in the ray tracing performance if you upgraded from a 3060 Ti to a 9060 XT. Now, that being said, let's take a look at the average FPS numbers to see, were they in general hitting playable frame rates? So this is just the ray tracing results. Now notice though that I'm including 1080p, 1440p, native, and upscaled. And what you can see is in each game, if you look at, again, I find 50 FPS plus to be very playable on a variable refresh rate display, at least in single player titles, which is usually when you'd be using ray tracing. We can see that the blue line in almost every game can get well over 50 FPS at some settings combination involving ray tracing. The only game where that was maybe not the case was 1440p Oblivion Remastered, and maybe Assassin's Creed Shadows as well, again on the 1440p results especially. But in most of the ray tracing tests here, we were able to get into playable settings on the 9060 XT, whereas oftentimes the 3060 Ti was simply just not playable, even using upscaling aggressively. That being said, it's important to note that while I tested a massive number of settings combinations in this video, I didn't look to very specifically optimized settings exactly for each of these GPUs, meaning oftentimes you could have done a more tailored experience to each game rather than just going max settings, medium settings, upscaled, not upscaled. Right, but anyway, in general, it looks like the 9060 XT is quite usable in ray tracing as long as you're willing to use some upscaling, and with FSR4, the upscaling does now look pretty usable. Now, another thing we could look at, though, is just how about 1080p versus 1440p? So let's look at that for a little bit. If we look at 1080p, now we're just looking at all tests, although all tests do include 1080p native as well as upscaled. So using like 1080p quality level upscaling. So you're on a 1080p display, either native resolution or upscaling to hit a 1080p output. Here's the overall results. We can see, again, with that 50 FPS line, the blue bar is generally at or above those playable numbers and is often much closer to like that high FPS territory, right? Where I would say, around 80 to 90 FPS is where you start hitting like really, really smooth frame rates, really nice experience for single player titles especially. So there's that. Whereas the red line with the 3060 Ti, we're often struggling to hit those higher FPS targets, but can often still get there. So it's important to acknowledge that. At the right settings, oftentimes medium settings with upscaling, the 3060 Ti is still able to give us a good experience in most games. Now, at 1080p, the average performance differential is that the 9060 XT averages 32% faster, although again, many results are well above that in situations where we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And again, it's completely out of date to say that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is fine at 1080p. In many of these games, 1080p went over 8 gigabytes of VRAM at certain settings. And at settings where the 9060 XT was quite playable. Now let's switch over to 1440p for a minute. Now at 1440p, again, either native or using balance level upscaling in order to hit a 1440p output to your monitor, we can now see that, again, the blue line is able to deliver you a smooth experience at some settings combinations in pretty much every game, whereas the red line is often more struggling to do so, right? So I think at 1440p, you might be really benefiting more from this performance increase because the 3060 Ti is struggling more in these games. Although that being said, usually, at least if you go down to medium settings with upscaling, we are able to get to some playable experiences even on the 3060 Ti still. If we look at average percentage increase, we're seeing that the 9060 XT is averaging 30% faster at 1440p. And it's just that that extra 30% is oftentimes now the difference between like sort of playable and nice and smooth, right? Or enabling much higher settings on average. So that's all the graphs I've got for you. What are my final thoughts here? I mean, so if you already have a 3060 Ti, is it worth the upgrade? And here's the thing. I've often cautioned people that if you upgrade for less than a 50% performance increase, you might feel underwhelmed by the upgrade. And so I'm gonna mention that here. I think that some people upgrading from a 3060 Ti to a 9060 XT may actually feel a little bit underwhelmed by the upgrade overall. I do think it's noticeable though. I think where it's really gonna be noticeable is in that VRAM increase, because there are so many games where you might have missing textures, stuttery frame times, and just overall poor performance. And having that extra VRAM means you don't have to be so cautious about what graphic settings you choose. You can just dial in the performance you want without having to be so concerned over, is it spilling over that VRAM buffer? Now, if you're mostly just playing multiplayer titles, especially competitive games at low settings, I really don't think this upgrade is going to be that worth it to you. That additional 30% isn't going to be that much. It's really in these bigger AAA single-player titles where 8 gigabytes of VRAM is starting to be a bit more of an issue, where I think the upgrade would be potentially more meaningfully worth it. Also, the fact that AMD does now have good upscaling, I think also makes it a lot more reasonable to make this jump than if it had been, a 30% performance increase, but now you're stuck with like FSR3. I'd be way more cautious on advising the upgrade. So here I would say we're at the performance numbers where I'm I do think you'll notice the upgrade, but it might be a little bit underwhelming, especially if you're mostly playing esports titles and things like that. But if you're mostly a single-player AAA game kind of person, that additional VRAM buffer is certainly going to be noticeable. But that being said, I think it's important to note that at the right settings, even in Monster Hunter Wilds, medium settings with upscaling was generally quite usable still on the 3060 Ti. So if this is still getting you by, I think, if you wait another GPU generation, you're going to be able to get a larger performance increase. And I think you might find that more worthwhile. Like I said, generally, in my experience, if it's less than a 50% performance upgrade, it can feel underwhelming for people. And I just don't want you to spend hundreds of dollars and then feel underwhelmed with the overall result. Now, if instead you're watching this video because you're deciding between buying one of these, you don't actually have either of these, you are actually thinking, hey, I could get a used 3060 Ti for some pretty reasonable performance, or if I was buying new, maybe I'd get a 9060 XT. I mean, let's look at that for a second. So 9060 XT, the 16 gigabyte versions are currently available as low as $360. So pretty close to their MSRP, although it's a little bit above it. But that's about where you'd be. Whereas if I look at like the average used price for a 3060 Ti on eBay, you're talking around $240. So you are saving over $100 if you go with the used 3060 Ti. But with that extra $100, you're buying double the VRAM, 30% more performance, and a new card. So you're in warranty, you'll have longer driver updates, all of that. So I do think that if you're really budget constrained, potentially that 3060 Ti could look interesting, but I'd also look into some other used options, like could you find a 2080 Ti, which has similar overall performance to the 3060 Ti, maybe a little bit faster, but with 11 gigabytes of VRAM instead. I would maybe push you in that direction, although you'd have to, think about your power supply and such. It is more power hungry and everything. So anyway, I think the most useful version of this video, though, is it worth upgrading from the 3060 Ti to the 9060 XT? And I would say that while it is noticeably faster and it's really nice to have that extra VRAM, I do think many people could still get by on the 3060 Ti and hold out for a more meaningful upgrade in the future. But if you do play a lot of single-player AAA titles, I think maybe it would be worth upgrading now if you're currently really unhappy with the experience you're getting on your 3060 Ti. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day. A huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, and channel members who click the join button to directly support financially. That makes running this massive amount of benchmarking a lot more doable for me. Also, as a member's perk, I don't like to paywall any complete videos, but I do give some extra content that isn't really a complete video. For example, this side-by-side footage, I was skipping through a lot of it. This actual video file is 56 minutes and 51 seconds. If you want to watch the whole thing without me talking over it or anything or skipping through, I do put up those complete unedited, I mean, they're edited side by side, but that's it. No talking, no graphs, none of that. Full side by side footage as a members only, just kind of extra perk there as a thank you to members. Anyway, so that's there. Feel free to do it. Totally understand if you don't. I hope all of you have an excellent day.